Well, welcome to episode 174 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about Yusef Lateef's album from 1962, fabulous album, Eastern Sounds. This came out originally on Moodsville, was a label. It's released much more frequently on Prestige. So Yusef Lateef doesn't often get mentioned in the same breath as the very top rank of jazz musicians, but it's kind of hard to understand why, because this guy not only had an epically long career, an incredibly diverse career, but he made enormous contributions and innovations, sometimes well ahead of people who are much more associated with those innovations. He was a multi-instrumentalist. He played the tenor sax, he played the flute, he played the oboe, he played the bassoon, and he played a whole bunch of other non-Western instruments as well, some of which he plays on here. He was also, following his conversion to Islam in the 1950s, an early innovator in using jazz as a spiritual vehicle, well ahead of Coltrane in that, and well ahead of Pharoah Sanders. This album, which is a brilliant album, is an articulation of many of those themes in its music. It's diverse, it's spiritual, it's experimental, and above all, it's really about creating a feeling in the listener. Yusef Lateef was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1920. His birth name was William Emanuel Huddleston. His family moved to Detroit when he was about 5, and there their father decided to change the family's name to Evans for whatever reason, so I guess he was the first ever Bill Evans. He goes to Miller High School, and recalling, of course, in the 1930s, under what was basically an informal apartheid system, higher education was not really available to Black people. The role of high school teachers in training this generation of jazz musicians that comes up in the 20s and 30s really can't be overstated. And he had a wonderful experience being taught by a guy called John Cabrera, whose dad had been a musician in Spain, and Cabrera introduced his own students to Spanish music, but also all kinds of other global influences. And this is the beginning of Lateef's lifelong love affair with a whole variety of different sounds. But Milt Jackson, the future founder of the Modern Jazz Quartet, was also in his music class. Kenny Burrell also went to the same school. When he graduated, Lateef was immersed in a Detroit jazz scene, which had a whole bunch of great players. And those, of course, included not just the people I've mentioned, but also Paul Chambers, the bassist, and the great drummer who would go on to play for Coltrane, Elvin Jones. He resisted going to New York for a while, but eventually he does go, starts making the scene, gigging with a number of eventually quite famous names. And in 1949, he gets invited to join Dizzy Gillespie's band, which he does, and he tours with Dizzy for about a year. Wanting to refine his knowledge and technique, in 1950, he leaves Dizzy's band, he goes back to Detroit, and he enrolls at Wayne State to take classes in flute and also music composition. And it's in this period where he has a real spiritual awakening and transition. He converts to Islam, and he starts this quest of having his music be something which can really carry you from this life to the next. Between 1955 and 1959, he's got a day job working at Chrysler in Detroit, but he's also leading his own quintet. He begins recording in 1957. He's hugely prolific, actually, at this time. Between 57 and 61, he puts out 15 records under his own name, and I think he participates in at least 15 others as a sideman. He also continues to fuse Western sounds with Middle Eastern, South Asian, and East Asian musical styles and instrumentation all the way through that period. He's deepening that approach. It's during this period, too, where he begins this lifelong habit of acquiring and sometimes actually making his own instruments. The rabat, which is a single-stringed instrument of Middle Eastern origin, was actually made for him by a guy that he met while he was working at Chrysler on the assembly line, a guy who was a Syrian immigrant who told him all about this instrument and eventually made him one and told him essentially it was 5,000 years old and so on. A lot of that information that he got from this guy in the assembly line gets repeated in the liner notes here. He goes back to New York in 1960. He plays with Donald Byrd. He plays with Charles Mingus, and eventually he gets a pretty good gig with Cannonball Adderley's sextet. But before then, he makes this record in 1961. The lineup of this record is Yusef Lateef, of course, playing tenor sax, oboe, flute, and shun, which is the Chinese globular flute. The great Barry Harris is on piano. Ernie Farrow, I mentioned before, is on bass. He also plays the rabat. And I should just mention, too, that Ernie Farrow is actually Alice Coltrane's brother. Finally, on drums is Lex Humphreys, who is not that well known and I think kind of underrated. He puts in an amazing performance. This is recorded by Rudy Van Gelder on September 5th, 1961 at his new studio in Englewood Cliffs, and it's produced by a guy called Esmond Edwards. Very interesting guy. In this era, he's one of the very, very few Black record execs or producers or movers and shakers of any variety. He produced most of Eric Dolphy's most famous work, which is no mean achievement. He also did almost all of Ramsey Lewis's production work. He worked with Lou Donaldson. He worked with Muddy Waters in the latter stages of his career at Chess. I think he's got something like 700 production credits overall. Interesting guy. The tracks here, and this is very typical of Lateef records of the time, combine both Western and Asian styles in sometimes contrasting fashions within the same tune. The various Eastern styles are often contained within one mode, which of course was very similar to what Miles Davis was doing at the time with his modal jazz. But the similarities, I think, are just coincidental. Lateef is a pretty serious scholar of music himself, and for the most part, he's confining himself to the scales which were typical of those musical traditions. Side one starts with Plum Blossom, and the really distinctive part of this, of course, is that Lateef is playing the aforementioned Chinese globular flute, or the shun, which is an instrument which is only capable of 5 notes and sounds for all the world like he's got 5 different Coke bottles lined up and blowing on them. I find it a bit of a novelty. It's an interesting track, however. You also have Pharaoh playing the rabat as well. The rabat is normally bowed, but Pharaoh is plucking this in pizzicato style. To me, the really interesting thing about this track, beyond the exotic instruments in play, is Harris's solo, which is so brilliantly integrated. And it sounds remarkably like Monk. Blues for the Orient is one of these songs where you really do have these contrasting passages. You have this very exotic sounding, sort of a Middle Eastern sounding intro over a few bars played on oboe. The song alternates between that melody and that feeling, kind of more haunting feeling of the intro, with this pretty jaunty 12-bar blues where you're no longer in the Middle East, you're squarely in New Orleans, and you go back and forth. Lateef on the oboe carries the melody for the first half of the song, but then Harris comes in on piano and once again manages to do this wonderfully integrated alternation of the two different styles in a fairly seamless manner. The guy really was a master. I mean, this is Lateef's record, but a lot of people have noted about this record, and I'll second this, that Harris fits so seamlessly into each tune, maybe because his mentor, Monk, himself was fairly liberated from Western forms in his own interpretations. He was considered a bit of a weirdo at the time of the jazz establishment. But something about that training or that influence really leads Harris just to be able to blend into the ideas that Lateef has here and articulate them, in some cases better, I think, than Lateef does. The next song is the possibly unfortunately titled Chink Meow. I'm not quite sure to make of the title. A lot of internet sources say this is Ching Mao with a G, but you can check all the early releases. It's definitely spelled with a Q. I don't know if it's some kind of dodgy play on words or whatever. I mean, this is 1961, what have you. Anyway, setting that aside and giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, this is a really appealing number. It's played in 5/4, but it's got a really great groove. This song is basically an excuse for an outing on tenor by Lateef. It's kind of Coltrane-esque, actually, his sound, and it sort of anticipates the kinds of workouts that Coltrane was doing 2 or 3 years later in and around the Love Supreme era. The last song on this side is Don't Blame Me, which is a ballad and one of the few jazz standards on the record. This is beautifully delivered. Again, the highlight is this delicate, airy solo from Barry Harris. For his part, Lateef's contributions are quite melodic, but they're straightforward. This is arguably dinner music, but what sets it apart from that category is just the sheer quality of the playing, and this ends what has been an incredibly diverse and really wonderful side of music. Side 2 starts with what I think is my favorite track on the record, which is Love Theme from Spartacus. This is a very spiritual feeling and sounding piece of music. It's something I think that Pharoah Sanders would have been quite proud to have put in any of his records from, say, 68 through 72. Snafu is a different kettle of fish. This is what you might call tough guy tenor, very reminiscent of Rollins or Coltrane from around the same era, but quite melodic and very feel-based, which was very much Lateef's style. Beyond Lateef's contribution, my attention here is really drawn to the excellent drumming work from Humphreys. Humphreys excels in the next song too, which is Purple Flower. This is a very intimate piece, and he does his fantastic brushwork. Takes you right, kind of Bill Evans trio kind of territory. That sort of rainy day, melancholy feeling that only the brushes can really give you. Love Theme from the Robe has Lateef playing flute, a conventional Western flute. Here, all 4 musicians are kind of glorying in delivering a track which is played at a pace and with enough white space which allows the very simplest elements of the music to shine. That's probably best heard during Harris's solo, but really through all 4 contributions. The final track is a short little track called The Three Faces of Bilal, which was written by Lateef for a friend of his who had a wife and 2 little girls who were the 3 faces, apparently. The key piece of continuity with the rest of the record is that Pharaoh is playing the rabat again, taking you right back to the very first notes of the opening track. Anyway, just a minute or so in length, and that wraps up the record. In my view, this is one of the great jazz albums of the early 1960s. It anticipates the spiritual explorations of the Coltranes, John and Alice, and Pharoah Sanders in the latter part of the 1960s. It doesn't just anticipate, though. In many cases, the music produced here would stand quite credibly alongside their contributions, which I think is high praise. It's a thoughtful, imaginative, and very beautiful recording. I think it's essential in a jazz collection, and I give it 5 out of 5.